Falchagaji, Korasaguran.
Falchagagokorayan Ansahoya.
Welcome to Conversations in the Grove, a show about Druidry in ancient and modern times. Thank you for joining us for our third episode of season 1. In our first season, we are discussing the relationship between animism and Druidry. And in our first episode, we defined animism and we discussed the similarities between animism, Druidry, and polytheism. In our second episode, we looked at Druids as healers and the significance of plants in Druid and animistic practices. If you haven't had the opportunity to view either of these two episodes, you can watch them for free by going to Dunmore Druid Order's public group Facebook page or the Dunmore Druid Order's YouTube channel. Please remember to like and subscribe. Before we get started, I want to ask the both of you how you're doing in the midst of this pandemic. It seems like COVID-19 and the coronavirus is really causing a lot of disharmony and differences of opinions. And so I'd like us to just begin our discussion with ethics and responsibilities and values, and having the two of you comment on what you're seeing that is being done in a way that benefits not only humankind, but also the natural world, and also perhaps comment on things that aren't being done but might be helpful if they're considered or undertaken, not just by us individually here in the United States, but by people globally.
Yeah, I think go on this one.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I really feel right now, especially that everybody's really, especially in the United States, we're really focused on our freedom to do this and that, and we don't have a sense of what our responsibilities are to each other right now, and it's frustrating because we're not looking at those things very closely, and we're focused on what we deserve or what we expect or what we should be able to do, and the consequences of our actions and how they affect others is being lost in that that obsession with freedom. And freedom's a good thing. I'm certainly not going to argue against freedom. Especially religious freedom, or for myself as being a Druid. But we are seeing the results of a society that puts their individual needs above the collective need. And if we are to survive as a civilization and as a species, we need to be of one mind on certain things. And we are not of one mind on a lot of things right now. And I don't know what the answer to it is, but I do know that one of the things that we have to really start discussing as Druids and as just people in general, regardless of your religious tradition or your unique background, we need to start looking at each other and finding things in common so that we can actually make our lives collectively better. And if we continually focus on what we deserve to do or what our freedoms are, and we completely ignore the fact that we have responsibilities to each other and to the whole web of life, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, it's isolationism and entitlement writ large, and played out in the worst way on the public stage for all to see and to the detriment of all. I mean, it's really a rather grotesque situation that we're in. And yeah, I mean, similarly to you, Ben, in terms of solutions, on a large scale, I really don't know. I mean, I keep coming back in my thinking and dialogue with people of late, I keep coming back to the idea that we have to work firstly on ourselves, and then secondly in our own contexts, in our own microcosmic communities. And I think part of that, it's not a resignation so much as two things, I suppose. One, knowing that unless the foundation is properly created within our own hearts, and then by extension amongst ourselves in small community, then no matter what we try to do beyond that, it's not going to stick anyway, right? It's not going to be adequately deep or effectual or sustainable. But also, secondly, I think there is a practical dimension to it that we really, some of this large scale stuff that involves, in our particular context in the United States, what is it, 350 million people, that, and the plutocracy that controls all these mechanistic systems and capitalistic systems that have been running and building up so much inertia for so long. Frankly, there's not much that we can do to change that right now. And so there's a really, I think, practical dimension to that approach as well, which is, again, not resignation by any means, not giving up the fight, so to speak, but just shifting maybe our focus around, where to begin that struggle. And I think always it begins right here, and then again, the next layer with us, as you were saying, Ben, with our families and our communities, our tribes, wherever we are. Tribe, of course, not in the way that it's popularly used now, which is in a pejorative sense, but tribe in the best sense.
Yeah. Well, and part of that too is we need to, I think my greatest frustration right now, particularly, is we are losing the desire to communicate with people who don't agree with us. And that's a real problem, because it creates it devolves us back into a time where we don't want to go again. And my particular perspective, one of the things that I'm the most passionate about with Druidry, I believe that the Druids and the whole system they set up was the initial goal of it was to lessen clan conflict, because it had become a real problem. And clan is a wonderful thing. Families are a wonderful thing. But the dark side of that can be when we think that our family or our clan is better than somebody else's, and we lose a sense of common destiny and common purpose. And I'm not advocating for some sort of whitewashed unification where nobody has any uniqueness and nobody has a particular cultural beauty or teaching, but we are, the role of the Druid was to be that arbiter between clans, between peoples, between tribes, to create some sort of collective understanding. And we, as a people, learned the hard way what happens when we don't unify with one another. And we have the continual run of imperial power that's taken place since that time. And we had the indigenousness. I don't know if I can say this word. Our indigenous nature beaten out of us, and now we're we've done that to native peoples, and now we're doing it to the planet. And we have got to look back at this wound that we've got and start reclaiming who we are. And the only way, I believe, one of the only ways forward is to step back into that understanding that we have a common destiny, and that our identity, is our identity is the land. Our identity is the sky and the waters and the trees and the mountains. This illusion of separation we have between us and the land and us and each other is the only real problem.
Yeah, I think one issue that comes up for me listening to what you're sharing, Ben, is the role of the Druid as you said, an arbiter, and also as a bringer of peace and of dissolution of conflict in a very overt, kind of astonishing way, actually, in the way that the classical authors describe this, that the Druids, if they saw that a conflict was unrighteous or for whatever reason undesirable, would walk right out into the battlefield and raise their arms and chant prayers or whatever they were doing ritually, and both armies would just go home. That level of respect for the sacred and for the judgment of the voice that speaks from the place of connection you're naming, Ben, that is a profound thing that's missing in our cultural environments in the contemporary West today. And this is why I often say, I said this in my recent book, but I say it all the time in different contexts, we need our shamans back, by which I mean for our cultural context in which we're operating here in this particular environment, I mean our poets, seers, our druids. We need those functionaries back, and they need to have a place of real respect and power, not in a manipulative way, but power to be able to speak authoritatively from a place of wisdom, right? And everything has become so kind of diffuse in our cultural and social environments that there really are no such voices of wise and health-giving and life-giving authority. I mean, who are those voices in our sociocultural context? We don't have them. We lost our sacral functionaries. And in the church, being somebody who's both in Druidry and in Catholic Christianity, I can speak to this too, that, it used to be that monastics, priests, bishops, etc., in the Western world were voices of authority. Whether they were abusive of that authority is another discussion, right? Not always good, but they did at least play that role for a long time, and no more, right? No more. I mean, only for a very small subset of the population. And even within the church, a lot of the spiritual integrity has been lost to where, you don't, in the Western denominations or jurisdictions particularly, you don't really get people who are sacrificing everything to be holy people who pursue wisdom and sanctification, etc., so that they can legitimately and authentically be that voice for the tribe, for the culture, for the society. You just don't find that hardly at all anymore. And that's a great loss and a great tragedy. And then it leaves this void where we can have a kind of cultural style of condemnation, where people are just totally at odds with one another and are not afraid at all to voice that in the most harsh and judgmental ways. And no one has the authority to say, that's not the way we do things. It just goes on unchecked. And I absolutely agree. This is a huge issue, and a contrast between what we see in the way that Druids functioned in ancient Celtic societies and our current sociocultural climate.
Yeah, well, I thank you both for sharing that information and sharing your viewpoints on it. And I will say that I concur with everything that you've said. One of the things that crossed my mind for me personally, and I expect this might be true for some of our viewers and listeners as well, as we study the multiple roles of the Druids, we find that one of the functions of the Druids was that of imparting instruction on morals and more broadly on philosophy. So many of these morals appear often or frequently, at least that's what I have found, in past and present day writings about the topic of Druidry. And from my personal studies, what I've discovered is there's one concept that seems to stand out among the others, and that is the concept of truth. So I would say, especially in the United States right now, there might be some sensitivity pertaining to the topic of the coronavirus and the aspect of truth. But to put it in a Druid perspective, I'm wondering, Ben, let's start with something that I learned from you very early on in my studies of Druidry, and that is the expression, the truth against the world. And I'm wondering, what do you think the Druids and our Celtic ancestors, why do you think they place such high value on truth? And how is that something that we might work to revive today in the midst of our pandemic, where it seems like there is some inaccurate information floating around?
Yeah, truth is incredibly important, because for me, the way I perceive truth is a lack of barriers over my perceptions. And we have so much clutter in our minds and in our consumption of media, online, written, on TV, whatever it happens to be. There's so much clutter coming into our senses on a daily basis that we take very little time to try to wipe those things away and let the truth actually speak, especially from within, or experiencing it when you're outside or in a place where the truth can actually talk. And when they say the truth against the world, my particular feeling on that is the world is often very obsessed with just about everything else but the truth. And I'm not going to try to define truth for anybody else, nor will I have anybody define it for me. But I know that when we have the Postal Service outside doing its duty right now, but I know that when we stop believing that truth exists and we decide that reality is only a conglomeration of what our present thoughts are, then that is a recipe for disaster and absolute and disillusionment. And that is, that may be the tendency of the world, but that isn't the way to truth. That is the way to a illusion of what truth is. And when you confine yourself to a particular narrative and you never step outside of that narrative, and then you're not learning, you're reinforcing what you already think, and you're going down the rabbit hole of what it is of a obsessive thought or an obsessive worldview that is leading you to a place that will distance you from your friends and family, will distance you from the land, and will create barriers between you and the world. So truth is a real commitment to truth is a way of knocking those barriers down and seeing another person or or another living being for what they actually are, which is just another part of you.
Brendan,
Yeah.
how do you feel about the idea of truth and how that ties into aspects of being a Druid? And I think that there are, a number of other virtues, if you will, that come up when we are looking into aspects of Druidry. But for the moment, I'll just turn things over to you and let you have a few moments to discuss your perception on truth and how it may tie in directly with what Ben said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think truth can only realistically be talked about when one is aligned in an integral way and in a deep way with the values of nature, of life. And so being situated kind of existentially, but also in terms of our own mental processing, where our hearts are at, our perception, in all those ways, being really firmly situated in an experiential understanding of what I would call interbeing, that we're all part of this matrix or web or whatever image one might prefer to use of life, of being and beingness. And I think truth can only emerge from that place. So if we're out of alignment with that, then we can't really grasp or let alone speak truth. Mm-hmm. And I think the sort of verity of a sacral class like the Druids in Celtic cultures comes from their position, their spiritual or existential position, as people who are rooted in those truths in an experiential way, and also, of course, in an intellective fashion. I mean, the Druids and poetseers were great scholars, the bards as well, and repositories of the cultural wisdom. And that repository of cultural wisdom, I think, reflects these truths of nature that I'm referring to and that Ben talked about. And it's only to the extent that they do that I think they can actually be said to be true in any meaningful way. And as you named, Ben, the truth is rarely, the truth in the sense we're talking about it now, is rarely something that is reflected by the world, right? And that Brythonic or Welsh phrase that you named, Arlene, the truth against the world. I'm not going to try the original Welsh. I have it in my mind, but I'll probably butcher it. So I'm not going to go for it. But
for me,
yeah. But that, I think, is an expression of, on one level. I mean, it has many layers of meaning, I think, actually. But on one level, it's an expression of this kind of difficult encounter that we were discussing earlier, of realizing that the world, meaning the human-made world, not the world of nature, not creation, but the human-made world, often is completely out of alignment with this reality that we're speaking of, that we're calling truth. And if we actually value life and we value connection and love and hospitality in the broadest sense, and all of the classic virtues that we would uphold and recommend in native Gaelic traditions, especially, then we have to be willing to go at odds with the world, to be against the grain, because often the world is, as we note all too well, consumeristic, violent, appropriative in all the wrong ways, materialistic, both philosophically and in a more literal outward sense. All these things that are corrosive to the values of life. So to embody truth and to be a witness to truth, if you will, requires oftentimes going against the world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for sharing your insights on that. There are some other values that I've come across in the course of my studies, and I'm willing to bet that many of us have as well. Honor, loyalty, honesty, hospitality, justice, courage, strength, judgment, discernment, wisdom, integrity, and virtue. And so this is a question for the both of you. Which of these values, if not all of them, do you think encompass the present day values of Druids and animists alike? And Brendan, I'll start with you on that.
I suppose it would really depend on the context. But I will say that, you know, there are some of these traditional values that are for contemporary Druids and for anyone in the contemporary Western world are really difficult to adequately live out in fullness, because the sociocultural context we're in basically negates them inherently. I mean, we've been discussing today the sad realities of a consumeristic, capitalistic style of society and its results for the world and for us as human persons. And in a cutthroat, materialistic environment like that, it raises a question, you know, how can we, for example, let's take hospitality. Can we really adequately live hospitality in the way that it was lived in the ancient world? I mean, if we think about the Irish Brehon law and the precedent set there for hospitality, if somebody comes to your door, you have no idea who this person is, and they come to your door, let's say in a storm or whatever, and need shelter, need food, you cannot refuse them, right? And if you do, it's an affront to the culture itself and its values. Now, how can we fully live that today in a society where there, as Ben, you were saying earlier, there is no unification? It's isolationist, and people think primarily about themselves and their own interests, and therefore there's such a low level of trust in general. I don't mean necessarily among people that we know and love and all that, but just taking the society as a whole. I mean, I would be admittedly very loath to allow a person, let's say a homeless guy who comes by my little cell here and wants to stay the night. I mean, that's not something that I would be inclined to do simply out of mistrust, you know. And because we've all been conditioned into this way of being that is so disconnected and so competitive and individualistic, and it has scarred people and destroyed people's humanity to the point where you do have to be genuinely concerned that, you know, people might not think twice about doing violence to you in one form or another, right? So I'm not wanting to make any sort of sweeping statements here, but just I'm saying this just to illustrate that some of these things are inherently problematized by our environment in the contemporary West, and maybe in America especially. So how do we live into those things? And I think a way that I see it being done is folks living into them, these values, in a microcosmic way with relationship to the people that are in their circles, the people they know. And I think that's a fine way to begin. And maybe, I mean, this would be a larger discussion, but I wonder if some of these things, while the spirit of them is totally relevant and we should make ourselves vulnerable to it and be shaped by it, by all these traditional values and virtues that you're referencing, Arlene. But I wonder if some of them, perhaps the spirit in which we receive and are shaped by them just inherently must be different than it would have been in the ancient world. So those are just some thoughts.